Today I'm working on a 1940 Evinrude Handitwin 3 horsepower. I've already gotten the magneto working and have spark in both spark plugs, both cylinders. I have good compression. I have the fuel tank being cleaned at a professional cleaner. It had some grit in the bottom and I couldn't get it out. The fuel line that goes from this fitting up to the shutoff valve on the tank was clear. The fuel shutoff was good. Now I'm working on this carburetor. This engine is bizarre to my way of thinking because there is no throttle plate in this carburetor. The air comes in the bottom and it gets sucked in through this poppet valve. And I don't know if you can see it in there when I push this plunger up. So the air comes up in that hole into this chamber, which is essentially what a reed valve does, but they call this a poppet valve. More detail about this carburetor. Fuel comes in here as I described. There's a fuel filter under this cap. Down through the center is a needle valve that's attached to a float that the needle runs through, and when it pulls up, when you start putting fuel in it, that plunger rod should rise until the needle valve is wedged in the taper in this chamber where the filter screen is. Then from there, the fuel has to pass over through a venturi of some type and go into that chamber where this poppet valve feeds into the intake portion of the engine. This is the mixture control, so I'm assuming this tube right here is where the fuel passes from the bowl into this section to get into the air chamber. What I don't know yet is what's lurking under here, unless it's the spring to make this poppet valve work. So I don't know what this chamber is. But I've started by taking these screws loose, and we'll take off the float valve. Now that the screws are off, I'm going to remove this cover. There you can see the rod with the float in the middle of it, but I won't be able to pull it out because it enters from the bottom. On the Gales and some of the other models, they didn't put a gasket on this lid, but this one has a gasket, which would make sense because these are supposed to be portable motors, and if you have fuel in the carburetor bowl and you don't have a gasket here and you tilt it on its side to tow it or store it or move it, it's going to dribble the fuel out, so it should have a gasket. Looking down inside here, the float doesn't have the varnish look to it, so I'm probably going to replace this guy. To remove this top retainer clip, I stuck a screwdriver right in there and pried apart just a little bit to slide this thing up, but I can't show you that because it takes two hands and I'm holding the camera by hand. Retainer clips out. The float is in my hand. It has a little bit of its varnish left, but I don't know. I think the amount of trouble it would be to try and save it. I have a new one in hand, so I'm going to put a new one in. You can see another retainer clip on the bottom side. So we have to get that one off to be able to get the rod out through the filter screen compartment. Okay, so what we've learned here is there's a notch in the rod. There should be a notch up here too, but I can't see it. I'll be able to tell when I take it out. And it was very difficult to get this little guy out. I had to roll it on its side and sort of make it open up a little bit so I could slide it up. I'll flatten it when I put it back on. Looks like a mud dauber has been working right here or something. That doesn't look factory, but I could be wrong. I'm going to take this cap off, which covers the filter screen, and then pull this float needle out. It didn't take much force at all to loosen this. So I imagine it was leaking if I'd have put fuel in it. This doesn't look very pretty. There's the screen. Not too bad on the bottom. I'm surprised there's not more debris. The gasket. Some kind of fiber gasket. And there's the needle. This is the needle valve. I think that'll clean up. There's the one notch for the one clip. And I don't see the top notch. There should be a notch at the top. Because as the float lifts, that clip at the top has to pull up this needle. Otherwise, the needle will stay down and the engine will flood. I may have to investigate that some more. I put this float needle valve on a wire wheel for a little bit, and you can see there's a notch on the bottom section, which is at the base of the float, because this wedge is in the bottom of the carburetor. And as the float goes up, this thing goes to the right in my hand, but would lift. But with no notch on the top clip, I'm puzzled that the float couldn't vibrate its way up and eventually just flood the engine, because there's no retainer to hold this. I thought maybe there was a groove, but there isn't a groove. I've sent out an inquiry. Maybe I'll have an answer. As I mentioned earlier, this is the mixture control. To start the engine, you're supposed to have this positioned over like this, which is rich. And then as the engine starts running, after you started it, you lean it out until you get the best speed. I'm going to end up taking this all apart. So I'm going to see if this will turn to the right and how many turns, and mark that, and then I'll know where to put this set screw to put this back in the right position where it had been running 30, 40 years ago. This motor hasn't run for a long time. It turned a quarter turn, didn't quite touch this flange, and that's where it was set, and it wouldn't clear anyway. The mixture handle is off. Next, I'm going to loosen this packing gland nut that goes around the needle, so that as the needle comes out, I don't damage the packing if it's still salvageable. Okay, the gland nut is loose. It was a 1/2 inch. And now I'll unscrew this needle. You could use a pliers, but I'll probably put the handle back on and flip it so that it's up instead of down, so it'll clear the flanges and I can spin it out with this handle. Okay, that was in the full tight position. I'm trying to do this one-handed, but essentially this is what I'm going to do until it's out. A lot of threads here, a lot of threads. Here we go. It felt loose. There it is. Similar design to what they use in the 50s model. A moment ago I described the packing gland. You can see it. It's the black sleeve inside the threaded section. I'm assuming this was rubber, but it's hard as a rock, so I'm going to have to come up with a replacement packing gland. I've tried touching the sides and it's just crumbling into powder. Okay, as I've cleaned the old packing gland out of there, it's pretty obvious that it was a taper on this side and a taper on the gland nut. So I think it was just an O-ring, 1/4 inch ID, and whatever the diameter of this thread is wedged down in there, and then the O-ring was just squished up against this needle. So I'll be able to replace that. Haven't cleaned it out with gum out yet, but here are the O-ring and seals that I have. This is a standard 1/4 inch ID 3/8 OD. I'm going to try that first. These are some leftovers I had in a carburetor kit that look like little wheel bearing seals. I may end up using those. We'll see. I'm going to remove these 3 screws for the poppet valve and then start cleaning this whole carburetor up. Loosen these screws, take the screws out. I'm going to have to pry this loose. That's going to take 2 hands. There was no pry location, but I was able to take the screwdriver and get just a little bit of the flange here. But the gasket is starting to separate. Part of it's starting to stay on the bottom and part of it's starting to stay on the lid. So I'm going to take a razor blade and insert it so that the gasket gets saved. I don't know if you can see what I'm doing, but I'm taking a box knife and gently working along the gasket so that it stays intact and doesn't split part to the bottom, part to the top. You can see I've worked the gasket so that it's free and not split all the way around. Okay, this guy was pretty tight. I had to work gently with a screwdriver, trying to not damage the gasket. So now it's technically apart. I'm going to do a little more investigation and see what's holding things together. That looks like a cork in the center. I don't know if that's like an end stop. I can't imagine what other purpose it would have. This plunger, the poppet, pulled out pretty easily. It just took 2 hands to coordinate to draw it out. It drew out slowly, which seems troubling because this thing should be popping up and down once every revolution of the crankshaft. So that would be multiple times a second. So it's probably a little gummy. And then looking inside, this is where the poppet was. There's some black debris there. But there is an opening right there. I don't know if you can see it where the reflection is. That would be the main Venturi jet. It's lined up with the main mixture needle. So I'm sure the fuel comes in through the bowl, through this tube, through this mixture adjustment, and squirts into the air intake there, and then mixes in this chamber, and this is the flange that interfaces to the crankcase. This elongated port right there, that's the fuel line that goes through this tube to the base of our main mixture, which then feeds up into here. So I'm going to stick the tube of the gum out in there and blow it clear, make sure fuel gets to this point, and from there through this point. Next, I took a little piece of wire, even though I blew through with gum out, and went in that oval slot, and I could see the wire down in the hole there. Okay, I've blown all the jets out, and I don't really understand something on this carburetor. This square with what looks like a screen over it, that's the air intake. So the air comes up through there, then it goes through this poppet valve, and then through this port with the screen on it that goes into the crankcase. So they have a screen here they have a screen there. But these 3 holes right here are straight through with no screen. So what is the deal here? Why would they do that? So why didn't they put screens over those? I don't know. All right, well, anyway, I'm not so worried about the outside as I am the mating surfaces for the 2 cap and this plunger rod guide thing and the hole where the needle, the float needle sticks in, that those are all proper. When I removed this cap, this was real stiff to come out. Now that I've cleaned all of the gunk buildup off of it, this is very loose fit. The only bad thing is this gasket has a little piece out of the top right here, and it's got a crack in it there. And although I was careful, I think it was already disintegrated because there was a chunk missing when I took it out. Now we're into the least favorite part of doing this carburetor work, and that's when you don't have gasket kits. So I got to take that gasket, lay it onto a piece of this Carapac from Felpro, and I'm not supported by Felpro, trace it out, and then carefully cut it to shape. It may take a time or two to get it right. Okay, so now I have the pattern traced out on the piece of gasket material. Using this razor knife, I'm going to cut the inside first, and then I'm going to take scissors and cut the outside, and then I've got a small hole punch, and I'll punch these 3 openings out. I just finished going around in a circle with this. I don't know if it's free all the way. I'm looking through a magnifying glass because I'm an older fellow. So there it is, trying to do this one-handed. Okay, so the inner circle is cut out. With the center hole cut out, it slides over the cap, and now I have to cut the notches and the perimeter. I'll use the scissors for that. Gasket's rough trimmed. After it's assembled, I can trim off the excess if I really want it to look nice. Next, I'll be taking these hole punch and cutting the hole for each of the screws. My other hole punch is bigger, and that would have cleared these holes out way too much. But these are too small yet for the what looks like number 8 screws, so I'm going to have to trim them open a little more. After I get it close, I take the screw and push it in, and the threads actually shear the edge of the hole clean. Holes are all cleaned out. This part's ready to go back on. I've confirmed that this poppet valve slides on here smoothly. There it goes. Then the spring. And you can see it moves freely. Then the cap with the new gasket. And it does not appear to have any orientation. So we're just going to put it on whatever way it fits. And then put the screws in. The screws are finger started. The poppet valve housing cap and assembly is all screwed together. I don't think I'm going to trim off this gasket. I don't think it looks bad. It looks symmetrical. A fellow member on Antique Outboard Motor Club on Facebook gave me a link to this float from Mercury that's a substitute for this float. It's plastic and it has a spring and it has to be removed, so we'll take a look at this. It's virtually the right diameter. It's a little bit taller. And I see the spring that has to be taken out. I just pulled the spring out, and I've been told you have to drill it out. It looks like it's good. Oh, somewhere in the inside there's a shoulder that it hits. So I'm gonna have to drill it out just a squeak. I know it's not scientific, but the drill box guide says that I need a number 42, so that's what I'm going to drill it at. I've pushed the float on to the notch that would be the underside. This is the part that raises up, and I've marked a line where I'd like to make another groove or an indent for the other clip so that this float can't slide up and down this pin. The groove in the needle valve is cut, and I've tried the clip and it holds in that slot, so that's perfect. The clip will fit in that notch, and the clip will fit in this notch, and then the float is trapped as this needle moves up and down. The taper on the seat is not very pretty down there. I may try just cleaning that up. Just gravity holding the pin in seems to be holding gum out. The float sticks securely onto the pin. Inserting the needle valve in there, I'm going to take this clip, I'm going to hold this needle valve down, turn the carburetor over, and slide this clip down until it hits that first set of notches at the bottom. Here you can see the first set of notches at the bottom and the new set that I cut. So the bottom clip is in position. Next I'm going to put the float on and put the top clip in. The top clip is in place. To aid in pushing the clips on, I stood up a bolt and pushed the carburetor down over it, holding the needle valve up while I pushed the clips on. That was a lot easier. And then after the clips were in place, I took a needle nose pliers and pinched them so they fit tightly in the groove. This is the filter cap and screen. I pulled that out of here. I don't know if you can see. It's got quite a bit of debris in it. So I'm going to clean that out, and then we'll put the filter screen and plug back in place. The filter screen is going back in this cap. It just sort of lays in there. I'll screw it into here. I'll apply a gasket and put this thing in the carburetor. Not with one hand though. You can see the needle valve cap and screen is loose started. I'll tighten it up the rest of the way with a wrench. The needle valve cap and screen are installed and tightened. There was a dirt pile here, and it turns out it was like a dirt dauber, but there's no passage or anything, so I just cleaned it out. Now I'll put the cap on. I cleaned the bowl cap, cleaned around where the gasket was. I was able to salvage that gasket, loosely put it in place, and finger started the screws. Last but not least is the mixture control needle and its bushing or packing, and I've slid the O-ring down in there, and like I said, this is a 1/4 ID 3/8 OD. It seems to be a pretty good fit, so I'm going to start with that and see if it works. I don't know if you can see the O-ring down in there. It's not squished out yet because the nut's not tight, but it's in place, so I'm going to put the needle valve in place. You remember I flipped this lever on the needle valve so that the offset is out instead of offset in. I'll turn that over, but it's in. Now I'm going to tighten the packing gland nut. With the packing gland nut tightened, not all the way, but enough, it's nice and stiff the way the needle valve should be. So this is perfect. So now all I have to do is flip this lever over and this carburetor is rebuilt. And there she is. Lever's turned over. All the jets are cleaned. Like I said, I didn't spend a lot of time on the outside. Poppet valve operates. You can see it work on the inside. Thanks for watching.